Nell Gwyn was an X-Rated Cinderella. Born in poverty, she became a professional actress, the beloved mistress of King Charles II, and died as an icon of the Restoration. However, all Nell's legendary insults and remarkable beauty couldn't save her from drama, scandal, and sorrow. Charles II took many mistresses, and some of them returned their king's infidelity. For example, he once caught one of Nell's rivals, Lady Castlemaine, in a not good position with the Duke of Marlborough. In contrast, Gwyn met Charles when she was just 17 and was faithful to him, not just until his death, but afterwards too. Nell was a true beauty. She had chestnut hair, light hazel eyes, and a dazzling smile. In contrast to the buxom bodies favored by Restoration beauty standards, Gwyn was petite, albeit shapely. She became especially known for her tiny feet, but that wasn't all that drew men to Nell. Nell had a couple more assets. Most portraits of the mistress actress emphasize her perky chest, with some displaying Nell in all her double-barreled glory. However, Nell Gwyn didn't always live the good life. Her early days are surrounded by mystery, but what we do know about them is pretty dark. Young Nell was born in Cole Yard, a filthy back alley of Drury Lane. Her father, Thomas Gwyn, was probably an ex-soldier with Welsh heritage, while her mother, Helena Smith, or Old Ma Gwyn, may have been descended from respectable folk like clergy and doctors. But boy oh boy, times changed. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong for little Nell. When Nell was still a baby, tragedy struck. Her father couldn't afford to pay his bills, and he was imprisoned in debtor's jail, where he perished. This left Nell, her mother, and her older sister Rose in a horrific situation. It wasn't easy for women to get respectable employment back in the 1600s, so her mother turned to the oldest profession in the book. She sold her body to feed her little girls. Nell worked a lot of odd jobs as a young girl, struggling in the London slums. From hawking fruits on the streets to serving booze at her mother's brothel, Nell worked hard. But some historians say that she kept a job so controversial that even bawdy Nell wouldn't admit it. Nell and her sister Rose may have made ends meet by becoming sex workers. When her rival mistress, Barbara Palmer, made a big show about her new fancy carriage, Nell came up with an ingenious plan to make fun of her newly acquired heirs. She rode up to the woman's estate in a rough little cart drawn by 6 oxen. As she whizzed around the building, Nell yelled WHOREs to market. Her message was clear. Barbara could dress things up however she wanted, but at the end of the day, they were both mistresses. Palmer didn't bother Gwyn after that. As children, Nell and her sister Rose worked as orange girls at a theater, selling fruit to the patrons. While on the job, Nell quickly became the mistress of the theater's leading man, Charles Hart. Cozying up with the head actor had its perks. Less than a year later, Gwyn joined the ranks of England's very first public actresses in 1665. Out of all Charles II of England's mistresses, Nell Gwyn was the most beloved by the common people. Her nickname of Pretty Witty Nell originates not from her time in Charles's life, but before, in her years as a popular comic performer. Londoners loved seeing Nell play sassy heroines in comedies and romances. Nell may have gravitated towards comic characters because she was hilarious in real life. For example, when her beau King Charles II got stressed out by all his mistresses hounding him for more money, he went to Nell for advice. She had an absolutely legendary response for the king. Lock up your codpiece, aka, keep it in your pants, my man. Long before they ever met, Gwyn's future royal lover, King Charles, paved the way for her career. Upon being restored to the throne in 1660, Charles II undertook a huge patronage of the dramatic arts and even legalized female actors on the stage. This movement allowed quirky gals like Nell to thrive in public life. But Charles II was not Gwyn's first aristocratic keeper. In 1667, Gwyn embarked on an affair with Charles Sackville. Sackville was a major catch. He was cultured, witty, satirical, dissolute, and utterly charming. His arguably most attractive feature, however, was that he housed Gwyn and gave her an allowance of £100 so she could leave acting. For now, at least. By the summer of 1667, Gwyn's good times were officially over, and she was back in the dumps. Her first sugar daddy, Lord Buckhurst, had dumped her. Her boss, Charles Hart, was ticked at her for running away, and worst of all, she was broke. It would take a royal godsend to lift her spirits. Little did she know, a royal bailout was just around the corner. In late 1667, the Duke of Buckingham was fed up with how Charles II's preferred mistress, Barbara Palmer, kept persuading the king to follow her political agenda. Determined to oust her from power, Buckingham began looking for a new hot rival for the king's affections. Then as now, it-girl actresses were the most eligible bachelorettes. Buckingham approached Nell, but her words left him speechless. Nell stunned Buckingham when he promptly demanded £500 a year in exchange for her services as the king's new mistress. Aghast at Nell's high price, Buckingham said he'd think about it and quickly offered the job to Moll Davis, who just happened to be Gwyn's rival in acting. According to satires from the era, Gwyn overcame her rival with an ingenious, if childish, plan. She simply slipped some laxatives into Davis's drink just before she was scheduled to attend to King Charles. This tale is more lore than history, but that doesn't make it any less entertaining. Gwyn was close friends with one of the first professional female writers in English history, Aphra Behn. In fact, tales from the time say that it was Behn who helped Gwyn slip those handy-dandy laxatives to Davis. According to lore, Gwyn footed the bill on her first date with King Charles II. The two met in adjacent boxes at the theatre, where Charles was more interested in pretty Nell than the show. The king invited Nell to dinner afterwards with his brother, the Duke of York. When it came time to get the check, His Majesty and his royal brother discovered they had no cash on them. Nell covered the expense and exclaimed in an affection of the king's voice and catchphrase, "Odds fish, but this is the poorest company I was ever in." Charles II was a notorious womanizer, despite coming from a long line of oppressed men with homoerotic urges. But maybe he inherited their preferences in his own way. In some accounts, Charles fell for Nell Gwyn when he saw her perform, not as a woman, but in a kinky twist when she was playing a man. Nell's cross-dressing wasn't a one-time occasion. In her younger years, she often experimented with wearing male clothing. Between 1663 and 1667, little Nell donned a beard and breeches, and even took the name William Nell, both on and off stage. Nell may not have received £500 from Buckingham, but Charles II felt differently. Compared to the high demands of all his other mistresses, £500 was chump change. He promptly gave Nell an enormous income of £4,000 a year. That number later rose to an astonishing £9,000. Nell was raking it in, but the good times wouldn't last forever. On May 8, 1670, Nell gave birth to her first son, Charles, the illegitimate child of King Charles II. Of course, for Charles, this wasn't such a big deal. Little Charles was his seventh son from over 5 different women. Even in the cutthroat world of London theatre, Nell was a superstar. As a sign of her power after she gave birth to little Charles, a stage company waited for months until she was finally ready to appear in their show. She was worth the wait. Her performance in the Conquest of Granada by the Spaniards would be her last play ever. After that, Gwyn left the stage for the court, but she didn't switch for a happy reason. By 1671, Nell was back at court on a full-time basis for a dark reason. After years of being Charles II's favorite mistress, she finally had some competition. High-born and sophisticated, Louise was the exact opposite of eccentric, good-time Gwyn. The vicious French court should have prepared Louise for some backstabbing antics, but Gwyn took it to the next level. Nell was not going to give up her man without a fight. Unlike the king's hoity-toity high-born mistresses, Nell could drink, swear, and effortlessly take down her well-bred rivals. When the king fell for Louise, Nell butchered her last name into Cartwheel. After a hard life, Nell Gwyn's mother didn't get a happy ending. She became a helpless alcoholic even after her daughter ascended to near royalty. Nell tried to help her mother recover, even placing her in a fine estate, but it was too late. After getting incredibly drunk, she drowned to death near her house in 1679. Nell never stopped trying to help her beloved mother, Helena, even after she passed away. At Helena's funeral, Nell said to have spared no expense. She opted for an elaborate velvet-lined coffin and even bid farewell to her mother with Helena's favorite activity, aka drinking. Nell supplied the mourners with a butt-ton of whiskey so they could toast Helena into the next world. English citizens, always loyal to Nell over the French-born Louise, were appalled that the king's foreign mistress was getting more expensive gifts than their beloved Nell. There was even a campaign to get the king to melt down Louise's new silver dishes and pour them down her throat. When she wanted, however, Louise could give it as good as she got, adding more than a little French sass to her comebacks. When Gwyn once offended her, Louise turned up her nose and snapped, "Anybody may know she has been an orange wench by her swearing." Louise may have dragged Nell for having a dirty mouth, but she wasn't wrong. Charles II was one thirsty king. He owned multiple topless paintings of Nell that he kept hidden behind serene-looking landscapes. Nell, meanwhile, was a little prouder of her assets. She displayed a nude portrait of herself right in her hallway for all her guests to see. The English court was a breeding ground for pettiness, but few exchanges rivaled the vicious sparring between Louise and Gwyn. For example, when Louise became an official duchess, she rubbed Gwyn's face in her achievement. She constantly insulted Nell by passive-aggressively bringing up Nell's low-born background. And this day was no different. Louise simpered that Nell had such petty clothes that she could be queen. Nell replied with her usual directness. She said, "And you, Cartwheel, look W-H-O-R-E enough to be a duchess." Nell's older sister Rose proved that the troublemaking gene was strong in the Gwyn family. Rose married a professional thief and even went to jail for stealing herself. Even so, Nell never forgot where she came from. She always kept an eye out for her sister, making sure the king gave Rose an income so she wouldn't have to steal ever again. You did not want to be Nell's enemy because she would go all out to humiliate you. She especially hated how Louise would pretend to be connected with European nobles by claiming incredibly distant links to some duke or duchess. So one day, when Louise strode into the court wearing head-to-toe black in mourning for the French prince, who she barely knew, Nell finally had enough. The next day, Nell dragged Louise for being showy and insincere. She steamed into the main courtroom, entirely in black, claiming she was mourning the Cham of Tartary. When a courtier asked Nell how she knew the Cham, her reply was utterly brutal. She said she knew him about as well as Louise knew the French prince, or in other words, not at all. Louise was livid with Nell. For Louise, this was the last straw. She confronted Nell about her extravagant pettiness, but Nell was absolutely unfazed. She looked Louise straight in the eyes and quipped that they should just divide the European nobles between them. On December 21st, 1676, Gwyn's first son, Charles, finally got a title befitting his status as a king's illegitimate son. One day, King Charles II came to visit Gwyn when she called over their offspring with, "Come here, you little bastard, and say hello to your father." Aghast, the king asked Gwyn why she would call her own baby such a word. She saucily replied, "Your Majesty has given me no other name by which to call him," and thus, Charles gave his son a proper title, the Earl of Beaufort. Nell was kind of known as the cool girl in Charles II's harem of mistresses. While her highborn rivals would demand Charles pay them more money and buy them fancier houses, Nell wasn't bothered. She just wanted a good time. So why was she so gung-ho about getting her son a title? The reason is simple: old school jealousy. The son of Gwyn's main rival, pretentious Louise, had received a title, and Gwyn was ticked. Gwyn affectionately called Charles II her Sweet Charles III. This pet name referred to her bedroom history. Nell had previously been kept a woman to Charles' heart, and then Charles Sackville. In February 1671, the king moved Gwyn into a luxurious brick townhouse in the fashionable district of Pall Mall. But by this point, renting wasn't good enough for Nell. Although she had free reign of the house, Gwyn insisted she needed to own it to feel truly free. Charles was so whipped that he gave in to her demands. In 1676, Nell moved in for good. Nell thought she could rest easy now that she'd owned her rival Louise, but just when she caught her breath, another competitor entered the courts. Hortense Mancini was a Roman beauty, runaway duchess, and all-round bamf. If anyone could unseat Nell, it was her. let the games begin. If Nell was intimidated by Hortense, just imagine how Louise felt. Poor girl was so freaked out that she resorted to actual violence, bashing Hortense's head on a bedpost until she had a black eye. Nell, meanwhile, used a softer approach. She got to know her enemy, hosting card games where she, Louise, and Hortense would wager extravagant sums of money and leave their shared sugar daddy King Charles II to foot the bill, of course. But all Nell's careful plotting was for nothing. Hortense was wild and could not be tamed. Get this, not only did she start an affair with the dashing Prince of Monaco, Hortense also slept with Anne Leonard, Charles II's illegitimate daughter, and then another royal on the side. When Charles II found out about all Hortense's indiscretions, he requested that Hortense get the heck out of his palace, and with that, Nell was back at the top of the king's list. Unlike Hortense, Nell only had eyes for Charles II. When a would-be suitor tried to hit on her, Gwyn took him down with a brutal assault. Appalled, she said she was way out of his league by comparing herself to a beautiful deer and her wooer as an ugly dog. In 1671, Gwyn gave birth to her second illegitimate royal son, James. He was named after Charles II's younger brother, but don't think that this means that Nell liked him. She was a proud Protestant who liked to have fun, while James was a die-hard Catholic, obsessed with doom and gloom. Despite his royal namesake, Nell's son James wasn't protected from tragedy. While he was away in Paris, James tragically died from unknown causes related to a bad leg at just 10 years old. Distraught, Nell raved that Louise had somehow poisoned her son, and that's not the only dark aspect of his passing. When Nell heard that her little boy had passed away, she fell into deep grief. But over time, her sadness transformed into a profound sense of guilt. Because Nell had allowed James to go abroad, she blamed herself for her young son's death. On February 3rd, 1685, also known as Nell's 35th birthday, she woke to a chilling sight. Her beloved king had gotten out of bed early to get his #1 mistress a gift, but while getting dressed, he suffered a terrible seizure. This was the beginning of the end for King Charles II. He dwindled for a few more days, but by February 5th, he was gone. On his deathbed in 1685, his last words were devoted to Nell. With his final breaths, Charles begged his brother and heir, the future James II, to let not poor Nellie starve. As Nell's creditors began to demand money, James II stepped in to honor his brother's wishes. He settled her debts and gave her a pension of £1,500 per year. After Charles II's death, Nell could have been sent to debtor's prison like her impoverished father. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but with the king's death, Nell lost more than a lover. Before his passing, she was going to be made Countess of Greenwich and finally receive a noble title. After Charles died, that opportunity evaporated. She would remain plain old Nell Gwyn for the rest of her days. Gwyn suffered a brutal stroke in March of 1687, paralyzing her spirited self on one side of her body. Just months later, she suffered another stroke that left her completely bedridden. At the age of just 37, Gwyn passed away on November 17, 1687. Scholars believe that the man who defined her life also caused her death, even from beyond the grave. Throughout all her time as Charles II's mistress, Nell somehow avoided catching any of his numerous STDs. But when she suffered her violent strokes, doctors placed the blame directly at Charles II's philandering feet. Nell probably had late-stage syphilis, contracted from her one and only beau. Even though she had a less than respectable job, the people of England adored Nell Gwyn. There was an enormous crowd at her funeral, and the nation mourned their beloved rags to riches mistress. She was a courtesan, but Nell was always kind to the poor, faithful to King Charles II, and she never forgot where she came from. She was the people's champion, and they loved her for it. Remember how Gwyn secured a noble title for her son by calling him a bastard? Well, there's another version of that story, and it's much more violent. In this tale, she holds the baby Charles out a window and threatens to drop him unless King Charles elevates their son to the peerage. Instinctually, King Charles cried, "God save the Earl of Beaufort," and I guess they went with that. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.